Let's talk about a really weird human quirk. Why are we, the smartest species around, so consistently, almost comically bad at predicting what's coming next? Well, it turns out your brain might actually be wired to get the future wrong. Let's dig in.
It's a real head-scratcher, isn't it? And we're not talking about just random guesses here. We're talking about the experts, the people with all the data, all the experience. And yet, if you look back, history is just a graveyard of their failed predictions. You want to see some examples? Okay, let's do a few. Back in 1900, experts looked at the smelly, crowded streets and said, by 2000, horses will be gone. And hey, they were right about that. What they totally missed was the car, which would solve one problem and create a brand new one called rush hour.
Okay, let's jump ahead to 1995. A major magazine, Newsweek, actually published this now infamous article explaining with great confidence why the internet was just a fad, that it was totally doomed to fail. Yeah, how'd that turn out? And this one? Oh, this is a classic. In 2007, the CEO of Microsoft, pretty much laughed at the first iPhone, said there was no way it would ever sell. You see, these aren't just simple mistakes. They point to something much deeper, a kind of glitch in the way we all think about what's next.
So what is going on here? Well, the first part of the puzzle is something psychologists call the inside view. It's our brain's default setting for looking at the world. And honestly, it's a huge trap.
The amazing psychologist Daniel Kahneman called this the planning fallacy. And it works like this. When we plan something, doesn't matter if it's a giant skyscraper or just a weekend project, we look at our specific, unique situation and we plan from there. And because of that, we always underestimate the time, the money, and all the crazy things that could go wrong. We're planning in a bubble, but the real world, it doesn't care about our bubble.
So on top of that big picture problem, our brains also have these little built-in blind spots, these cognitive biases that mess with our judgment. And one of the most powerful is something called the anchoring bias.
So here's how it works. Your brain grabs the very first piece of information it hears about a topic, and it holds on tight. That first idea becomes a mental anchor. And from that point on, every other piece of information gets judged based on how it relates to that first anchor, even if the anchor itself was completely random.
And you want to see just how powerful this is? Look at this. In a famous experiment, researchers had people spin a wheel of fortune that would land on either 10 or 65. Then they asked them a totally unrelated question. What percentage of countries in the UN are African? The people who spun a 65 guessed a much higher percentage than the people who spun a 10. A completely random number shaped their answer. Now just imagine what that does to us when we anchor on today's stock price or the last scary headline we read.
All right, let's talk about the next blind spot, the availability heuristic. This is a mental shortcut where your brain basically says, if I can think of an example easily, it must be super common and likely to happen again. The more vivid and emotional the memory, the more probable it feels, even if it's actually incredibly rare.
And here is a perfect, if tragic, example. After the horrific events of 9/11, a lot of people stopped flying and chose to drive instead. Now, we all know from the stats that driving is way more dangerous than flying, but the images of the attacks were so powerful, so available in everyone's mind, that it completely warped their sense of risk.
And because of this, we end up worrying about all the wrong things. We overestimate the odds of these big, dramatic, movie plot futures, AI takeovers, killer asteroids, because they're so easy to picture. And at the exact same time, we underestimate the slow, boring, but way more powerful forces that actually change everything, like interest rates and shifting demographics. Okay, fine. So our brains are a little glitchy. But the experts, right, the people who get paid to do this stuff, surely they're better at it. Well, a massive 20-year study by a psychologist named Philip Tetlock came back with a pretty uncomfortable answer.
This was the result. After collecting thousands of predictions from hundreds of experts on big world events, their collective accuracy was barely better than a coin flip. And get this is the real kicker. The more famous the expert, the more confident they were on TV, the worse their predictions actually were.
So Tetlock came up with this brilliant metaphor to explain it. He said you've got two kinds of thinkers. You've got hedgehogs who know one big thing. They have a single grand theory for how the world works, and they apply it to everything. They're super confident, great on talk shows, but they're terrible forecasters. Then you have the foxes. Foxes know many little things. They use lots of different mental models, they're okay with uncertainty, and they're always updating their beliefs. And it was the foxes who were consistently better at seeing what was coming. So you have to wonder, if our brains are so full of these flaws, why did we evolve this way? Well, what if some of these bugs are actually features? What if they're part of a survival code? And maybe the most important one of all is our built-in bias towards optimism.
Think about this for a second. About 80% of us believe we are an above-average driver, which is, mathematically impossible. That's the optimism bias right there in action. Most of us also think we're less likely than other people to get sick or get laid off.
Neuroscientist Tali Sharot makes this amazing point that this isn't a mistake. It's actually an evolutionary advantage. Think about it. A perfectly rational, realistic view of the world and all its dangers, well, that can be paralyzing. It's our irrational optimism that pushes us to take chances, to start a business, to explore, to have kids, to build things, even when the odds are stacked against us. It's the engine of progress.
So does this mean we're all just doomed to be terrible predictors? Absolutely not. Because in a follow-up study, Tetlock found a small group of people who could consistently, and I mean consistently, beat the odds. He called them super forecasters, and they give us a whole toolkit for how to think better.
And this is the most amazing part. These super forecasters, they weren't geniuses. They didn't have access to some secret intelligence. They were normal people, pharmacists, engineers, stay-at-home parents. They weren't smarter than the experts. They just thought in a fundamentally different way.
So how do they do it? Well, first, they think in probabilities. Nothing is ever a yes or a no. It's a 30% chance or a 70% chance. Second, they are constantly updating those numbers. Their beliefs aren't set in stone. They're just temporary guesses waiting for new information. Third, they take these huge, vague questions and they break them down into smaller, testable parts. And maybe most importantly, they keep score. They actually track their predictions so they can see where they went wrong and learn from it.
And this gets to the very heart of it. The goal isn't to get a perfect score or have a crystal ball. The goal is simply to be a little less wrong today than you were yesterday. It's all about intellectual humility and just focusing on the process.
So when you boil it all down, what's in the toolkit? It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being humble enough to know you might be wrong. It's about thinking in shades of gray, not black and white. It's about being willing to change your mind and being honest enough to admit when you mess up. Look, our brains evolved for a much simpler time, but we can learn to upgrade our thinking for the world we live in now. The future doesn't belong to the most confident people. It belongs to the most curious. So the real question isn't whether you're going to be right or wrong. It's how are you going to start?